Hello and welcome to Serial Knowledge Crimecast. I'm Meg.
And I'm Brianna, and we are so excited to be recording our first episode. Meg and I have gone way back as friends, but we never actually had the chance to meet until this last year. Our parents have been friends since the 90s, I believe, when they met on a serial killer central messaging board. I actually remember the days where my mom would take our living room TV and plug the computer keyboard into it and be able to type in and talk to all of these people, and she's made lifelong friends through that. And now I have the opportunity to have met Meg as we've gotten older, and we bonded on our natural love of true crime. It's kind of embedded in our DNA at this point. So we're very excited to be able to share that on this podcast, and we hope that everybody enjoys what we have to talk about.
Yes, we're very excited. We are going to start this episode with two, I feel like, pretty well known cases. The first case we are going to start with is the case of Scott Peterson and Lacey Peterson and their unborn child, Connor.
Yes, and these cases that we're going to be covering today are ones that were popular back when the start of media with trials and with true crime really kind of started to kick in. And these cases both have kind of come to new light with evidence that is potentially going to get these folks released. It'll be interesting to see what happens there. So, like Meg said, the first one we're going to be talking about is Scott Peterson. And a little bit of that case overview is Scott Peterson was married to a woman that he met in college named Lacey. And while she was 8 months pregnant on December 24th of 2002, Scott Peterson went and took his boat out to the Berkeley Marina to go fishing that day. And when he came back, his wife Lacey was missing. Now, like I said, Lacey was pregnant. Scott Peterson did not call and report her missing for some hours afterwards. And it was not until April that Lacey was found in the water about a mile away from her unborn son, Connor. Lacey was discovered on April 14th, and she was missing her head, neck, forearm, and one foot. And Connor was discovered on April 13th of 2003. Now, why was this so interesting to people? It was because this was this all around picture perfect family. Scott Peterson was, for all intents and purposes, a very good looking man. Lacey was gorgeous. They were about to have this baby. They were doing well in their personal lives. It just really seemed like this was that typical all American family. And Scott Peterson, throughout the course of this case, his behavior on the outside just was so strange to people that it really just captivated everyone. So nobody knew, of course, where Lacey was. Nobody knew how she had died or if she was still alive. And so that is where this strangeness came from. Scott Peterson ultimately ended up being arrested, and he was convicted of murder of Lacey and Connor Peterson.
The public has been very fascinated with this case, I think, from the beginning, with the media coverage and the tabloid coverage, and how he was acting from the beginning, not really showing many emotions, understandably wanting just to get Lacey's face out there, not wanting his own face out there, which is understandable, but at the same time, is that related to guilt, or is that him just wanting to find his wife?
No, absolutely. And I think that this new wave of attention to his case that has recently come up. We'll talk about it later. He has been taken over by the LA Innocence Project. I think it's posing a lot of questions to people. Was he wrongly convicted? And did the evidence point clearly to his guilt? Meg and I have spent the last couple of days watching these new documentaries that have come out and are trying to formulate our own opinions here.
Do you think that he was wrongly convicted, or do you think that all evidence points to him being guilty?
I think that there are very valid points to both. This may be the unpopular opinion, but based off of the new evidence that is coming out or the potential new evidence that could be coming out, I think that it could potentially point to the fact that he actually was the innocent husband. But we'll discuss it a little bit later why I'm having a hard time giving a conclusive answer.
Those new documentaries, we have one on Netflix called American Murder, Lacey Peterson. And that is just a Netflix documentary. But then you have the Face to Face with Scott Peterson documentary on Peacock, which is an LA Innocence Project documentary.
And so I think this too brings up a great point to the public and the media's role in these cases.
The media in all of this and the public agreed with the guilty side of it, saying that he killed his wife. They wanted him to basically rot in prison for the rest of his life.
Yeah, they were going after him for the death penalty. He did end up getting the death penalty. He did everything wrong in their eyes.
Right, which is what the LA Innocence Project is now trying to fight.
Yeah, and then you have people like Nancy Grace, who had her own show back in the day, and I think Nancy Grace is a very strong and aggressive opinion.
Yes.
Whenever you have Nancy Grace that does not like somebody, she's very loud and yelling, and I think her saying he's guilty, he deserves the death penalty, he did it, you get that whole trial by media situation.
Yeah.
So he's already guilty before he even gets into the courtroom. But whenever it did come to the evidence against Scott Peterson, I find this case very interesting because of the fact that he was tried and found guilty of completely circumstantial evidence. But one of the things that did not go well for Scott Peterson as well was the fact that throughout this search for his missing wife, it comes out that he has an affair. This woman named Amber Frey, she calls the police and she puts in a tip and says that she is his girlfriend, that she's been dating him. So again, we're going to think about the fact that Lacey went missing on December 24th. On December 9th, Scott Peterson is at a party with Amber and tells her that he's lost his wife. How do you lose your wife before she goes missing?
Right.
On that same day, Scott Peterson buys his boat. None of his family knew that he had owned this boat. None of his friends knew that he owned this boat. Your wife goes missing on December 24th, and then her body is found in water out in Berkeley Marina near where he had gone fishing. A bit strange. The other key evidence against Scott Peterson was the conditions of the bodies, how long they had been in the water, the timeline of Scott Peterson's day that day. He woke up, he went to the marina, he called Lacey on his way home. He was only at the marina. Now, this was about 90 minutes away from his house, which makes it even stranger the fact that she was found over there as opposed to at her own home. He says that he was going fishing. He calls her on his way home and leaves her a voicemail, and that's at like 2 o'clock. Now, people are not going to drive 90 minutes to go fishing for an hour or two and then come back home. I found that to be incredibly strange. But Scott was trying to say that he was just testing out this boat. But the forensic evidence before that, they found that he had been searching the tides and the tide movements on his computer. So it makes you wonder as well, was he looking that up for innocent reasons, or was he looking that up because he was trying to find the best place to dump a body? Now, there's also plenty of evidence, I feel like, for alternative theories, but there's such a lack of a crime scene. There is nowhere that shows for sure that Lacey was kidnapped from this spot. Lacey was murdered in this spot. There's inconclusive forensics that have happened, and there's a lack of physical evidence. Everything here is just so circumstantial that there is nothing that I felt like definitively said, like, yes, this is what happened, this is how it happened. Because their bodies were so badly decomposed, there was no way to find an actual cause of death.
Yeah, I think really the only evidence that they even have against him at this point is the anchors that he was making in his garage at his job.
Yeah, and there was anchors that were missing as well, and they tried to say that there was space where it showed that there was 5 of these cement block anchors that were made and 4 of them were missing. So they said, that, oh, four of them were one for each limb. But I do think it's interesting to talk about how, the trial was able to convict him on circumstantial evidence. Now, that was the defense's whole strategy whenever it came time for the trial, was to discuss the lack of the physical evidence that tied him to the murder. But ultimately, whenever it came time for the jury's deliberation and verdict, he was convicted of first-degree murder for Lacey and second-degree murder for Connor, and was given the death penalty.
Yes, and that had a very strong reaction with the public. Public wanted the death penalty. They wanted him to spend the rest of his life and die in prison.
I think another reason that the public felt so strongly towards this was because whenever he was arrested, after the bodies are found, he is in San Diego and he has dyed his hair. He has what looks like kind of survival kit, and he's got a load of cash on him. Originally, because everything that I knew about this case was from the media, I was like, oh, he's so close to the border. He's definitely going on the run. And through the documentary, the Face to Face documentary, it talked about the fact that his family lived in San Diego. He was going down there to spend time with his family. Now, again, could be a very convenient excuse to say why he was down so close to the border. They were saying that the cash was from a sale that he had made with his brother, and that he had dyed his hair because he didn't want to be recognized by the media because he was so tired of them coming after him. Again, I feel like there are points to be made on both sides of this, whether that incident pointed to his guilt or whether it pointed to he wanted to be a grieving husband and go spend time with his family.
Yeah, understandable. I mean, I can see both sides of that. I think those are very strong points. I think being in the public eye for so long, maybe he just needed a change. Maybe, he knew he was being followed and he needed to find a way to disappear. And that was the only way he knew how.
Yeah, and even whenever he was actually being arrested, he thought that it was the paparazzi that was following him. So he was being evasive because he thought that it was the media coming after him, and it turns out that he was getting arrested that day. Now, I do find there are some very interesting alternative theories that were addressed back then but brushed off. December 24th, when Lacey goes missing, there was a burglary at a neighbor's home. The issue with this burglary is that nobody actually seems to be able to nail down what day it was, because this home in Lacey and Scott's neighborhood was burglarized while these people were out of town for the holiday. So a lot of people are feeling like, did Lacey, whenever she was out walking her dog that morning, did she roll up on a burglary in progress and that they killed her because she confronted them for it? Because when Lacey disappeared, a neighbor found Lacey's dog in the road without Lacey and put the dog back in their yard. So this was about like 10 o'clock that morning of December 24th. Now, with this burglary too, the burglars have come out and admitted that they burglarized this home. Now, what else I find to be very interesting was that about a mile away from Scott and Lacey Peterson's home, there was a van that they found that was burned with a mattress that appeared to have a blood stain on it in the back. Now, whenever they initially tested this stain on this mattress, it showed that it was positive for blood. It came back positive for blood. They took another sample and they tested it again, and it showed that it was negative for blood. So they decided, okay, then no, that's not blood. But I find that to be odd because I wonder about what the quality of this sample was. I also think that there's a lot of inconsistencies in the timeline for this day. Like I said, Scott Peterson had left to go fishing. Lacey was walking her dog during the day, but different neighbors testified that they saw her in different locations on a different timeline from when the dog was actually found. So nobody can get an actual grasp on when she actually went missing, aside from knowing it was that morning. With all of this, I do wonder, was this trial fair?
Based on the evidence that they had, and not my opinion on this case, I would say Probably not. I would say that they don't have enough evidence pointing directly to Scott. Obviously, trial had to be had. The verdict, I can't say I necessarily agree with based off of the evidence. I don't think he got a fair trial.
Agree, because I think there's enough reasonable doubt that can be introduced here, because the prosecution is the one that has the burden to present all of this evidence. The defense just needs to create the right amount of reasonable doubt. But I wonder, because of the notoriety of this case, did it affect the jury?
Right. And this had a lot of media coverage, highly televised. Was the jury biased? Did they know anything about this case prior to the trial?
Since this has happened, there's been other information that's come out. There's been information through jailhouse informants that I find to be very interesting, and it has all been written off as just jailhouse rumors. So one of those that I find to be interesting is that there was a jailhouse informant that stated that he heard that Lacey had been killed by a group called the Modesto Hardcore Skinheads, and that this was a part of their burglary spree that they had been on in this area of Modesto. And then Stephen Todd and Donald Pierce were the ones that were arrested for the burglary of the neighbor's home. And a jailhouse informant stated that Stephen Todd had called him from the actual burglary because he needed help removing a very heavy safe from that home. I just think that these are things, again, that there's avenues here that I feel should have been discussed more. So there's a gap here in looking at some of the other alternative theories. It was, for me, it almost just seemed like they always go to the husband. The husband is the first one. And it felt like, in a way, instead of a presumption of innocence, I think he had a presumption of guilt here. There have been multiple efforts to try to get this case retried, to try to get some more evidence brought in and introduced and allow them to actually use that. One of the things that has recently happened was that in 2020, they were able to actually overturn his death penalty because there were jury issues. So he, at that point, was resentenced to life without parole. Following this, the Los Angeles Innocence Project took over his case, and they have been filing motions for DNA testing. They have filed motions to have 14 pieces of evidence tested, and one of these was a piece of tape that was found on Lacey's pants when she was discovered in April of 2003. And there was some evidence from inside the van and evidence from the burnt mattress that they have wanted to test. Now, my issue is that the court denied the testing for the DNA that was on these items. And I think that that makes it incredibly unfair, because it makes it to where you can't actually formulate a decision because you're not getting the full information.
Yeah, I think that it's going to make it really difficult to prove his innocence. He didn't have a fair trial, so this is his chance of getting a fair trial. And if they are unwilling to get that evidence DNA tested, he still will have no chance of a fair trial.
Obviously, he was tried, he was convicted. So, in legal terms, he is guilty. But I think that there have been a lot of things that have come out that can go towards his guilt or to his innocence. And I do find it frustrating that there's the potential to have that there and not actually get a legitimate answer, especially with the way that DNA testing has evolved since early 2000s, whenever all of this was coming around.
Right.
So, I mean, what do you think? Guilty or innocent?
I think based on evidence that we have this far, I would say that he's innocent, just based off of the evidence. My gut and my thoughts are that if he didn't do it, who did?
Absolutely.
Because the only real evidence that they even have points to Scott and the affair. If he was having an affair, who's to say he didn't get rid of his wife to solve that problem and be able to just move on?
That is one thing I will never understand either.
Yeah.
Is like, do people not know that divorces exist? I mean,
Exactly.
I feel like you see so often the first person in a murder that they look to is the spouse of the person. It's like, just get the damn divorce. I don't understand it. That is one thing that will always blow my mind.
It is. Murder, I guess, is the easier way out of things like that.
I suppose
You
so.
spend the rest of your life in prison, but at least you don't have that problem anymore.
Now we are on to the one that I have been going crazy to talk about. And now this will be the case of the Menendez brothers. So they have had new documentaries that have come out recently. Monsters by the Eric and Lyle Menendez on Netflix that was produced by Ryan Murphy. Now this is the more dramatized version of events. And then there's also going to be Lyle and Eric Menendez actual documentary coming out where they speak on their case from prison. I think that this has become so glamorized over the last couple weeks since that show has come out. We have even seen things that we never thought we would see, like the resurgence of Milli Vanilli and the if I hear Blame It on the Rain one more time, I'm gonna go crazy. For those of you who do not know about the Lyle and Eric Menendez case, they were these very affluent brothers. They lived with their parents in Beverly Hills, Jose and Kitty Menendez. And on the night of August 20th of 1989, they brutally murdered their parents in that Beverly Hills home. They went in there with shotguns, and the brothers shot their father while he was sitting on the couch watching TV, hitting him in the back of the head. The mother tried to run from the room. They chased her down and they shot her multiple times. It was just an absolutely horrific killing with shotguns. And it seemed that the scene was said to have resembled that of a violent execution. And after the murders, the brothers attempted to cover this up by making it look like a really bad botched robbery. That same night, they went out after these murders to a movie, and then when they returned home, they called 911, pretending to have discovered their parents' bodies, just absolutely sobbing, crying to 911. Now, they initially stated that they thought that this was a mob hit because of their father's status within the music industry. Now, the father, Jose Menendez, was an executive at RCA Records. It initially looked like it was a case of greed. The brothers wanted money. Later on, and this is what we'll get into later, there's questions of was this actually done in self defense?
When the cops were investigating, they were somehow able to avoid suspicion for months, living off of their parents' money. They spent about $700,000 on Rolex watches, courtside tickets to basketball games, properties. How they were able to do that and not raise suspicion is beyond me.
Yeah, and I absolutely think that they looked suspicious on the outside during this time. I think that it was just that there was no legitimate evidence to pin this on them. And it seemed like what they really did was say, oh, we're spending this money because we're so sad, we're grieving.
Yeah.
And now to the confession, to the psychologist of Eric Menendez, Dr. Jerome Oziel, is actually the one who broke this open and ended up getting them arrested because Eric was having such a difficult time with the murder of his parents that he actually confided in Dr. Oziel that he did it. There was an ethical dilemma, obviously, from Dr. Oziel of I have this patient confidentiality, but also this is a horrifically brutal, gruesome crime that my client has just admitted to. So what Oziel ended up doing was recording all of these sessions that he had with the brothers to be able to kind of save himself. But in the end, it ended up being Dr. Jerome Oziel's girlfriend. Now, I would also like to point out Dr. Jerome Oziel had a wife. Judalon Smith was the girlfriend and also patient of Dr. Oziel. And she ended up finding out that there was this confession to Dr. Oziel from the brothers. So Judalon Smith went to the police and tipped them off. She stated that she felt fear for her life because she knew about what these brothers had done to their parents.
Now, do we feel like she did it because she was scared or just because he would not leave his wife for her?
I definitely feel like there has the potential to be some spite here because what's a way to get back at a man that has broken your heart than to absolutely dime them out for this? Because it ended up looking really bad on Dr. Oziel. I think that she was pissed off that he didn't leave his wife for her.
Absolutely. And I feel like it could be a little bit of both. You
Yeah.
know, I feel like she knew what she knew, and if they had found out that she knew, what's to say they wouldn't do something to her as well?
After all of this, the brothers obviously are arrested. They went to a trial. They had two different juries, but they were tried together. So this was in 1993 to 1994, this first case went. The prosecution really just showed these to be some greedy, spoiled, rich kids who just murdered their parents. It basically for sport is what it seemed like. They just wanted to have the money, and they were just absolutely no regard for human life. They just were so crazed about the money, and that it was very premeditated, and that the brothers had been planning this for a while. Through the trial, it comes out that the brothers had been emotionally, physically, and sexually assaulted by their father for their basically their entire life, that they had just gone through absolutely brutal abuse. And I think that this was the defense's way of saying, I don't think that it was premeditated. I think that the brothers were finally at their wits' end, and they didn't want to handle this abuse anymore. During this trial, both of the juries were hung juries, on to a trial number two. But throughout all of this, it became just such a media spectacle because of places like Court TV. They televised this trial. Now, these brothers on camera stating these years of abuse that they endured. And so it brought in a lot of speculation in the media of why did this just come out? Were they actually abused? A lot of people were questioning whether this was just a defense technique or if this was like a legitimate defense.
Right. And we have to focus on the financial motives in this case as well. Were they on the life insurance? Because I know there was a lot of, maybe back and forth with that. Like, at one point, they were supposed to be taken off the life insurance. In this documentary, it shows that one of the brothers took that new life insurance policy, the one that had them taken out, and they got rid of it. So, were they still on the life insurance or were they not? We know their family was very wealthy, so we know they had money. Do we think that that had something to do with why they killed their parents, or do we think that it was the abuse that they allegedly suffered?
Yeah, and I think that there's great points to be made again for both. I don't think that it's a question of did they murder their parents here. What
Right.
I find is where the morality comes in, because we know that they murdered their parents. They said that they did. But the huge question that overhangs is why, and believing the legitimacy of which claim. Now, whenever they went into their second trial, I found that the judge really kind of reined this in. So the second trial was 1995 to 1996. The sexual and emotional abuse allegations continued through this trial. And now they were also saying that although the mother did not sexually abuse the boys, the mother was very, very emotionally abusive towards the boys. So the boys just had it from both. The mom, they alluded that she was an addict, that she just had a lot of mental health issues, and that the dad was just this very aggressive, overbearing. So the defense wanted to state in this second case, they really wanted to emphasize the fact that the brothers were fearing for their lives, which is why they killed their parents, that they just, it was desperation, it was terror, it was wanting to be free from that abuse. They had to go over the years of alleged sexual, physical, and emotional traumas that they had to endure at the hands of their own father. But here, the judge significantly limited the defense's ability to introduce these claims. So that makes me wonder, did this change the view of the jury because they didn't get the full story? And in this second trial, they were both convicted of first degree murder. And the only reason that they were sentenced to life without parole as opposed to the death penalty, there was one person that was wanting them to get the death penalty that was just kind of trying to hang the jury again, and they ended up having an emergency, a medical emergency during deliberations on this, and so they had to put somebody else in from their backup jury. They kept them from getting the death penalty.
So the public was very for that there innocent, they suffered all this abuse, they should be let free. Do you think that based off of the actual evidence that we have, were they innocent or were they guilty?
Yeah, no, so I don't think it's a question of if they did or did not kill their parents, because they did. But I think that there also comes in, again, the moral side of this. We need to believe victims. We need to believe, especially male victims of sexual abuse and sexual assault. But I feel like it's just this one is absolutely a morally conflicting case.
Right.
But I feel like if they were to be let out of prison tomorrow, I wouldn't care if they were my next door neighbors. I don't think
Yeah.
that if they get out, that they're a danger to society.
Right. They are not serial killers.
No.
They are, at this point, those were the only murders that they had a part in.
And I think that this was a product of their environment. I think that they took
Exactly.
the way that they felt like was going to be the guaranteed way out of this.
Right.
And I also feel like they have done a lot since they've been convicted.
Yeah, they have both gotten married. There has been a very vast majority of people interested in their case that are still wanting them to get a retrial. So this stands, I feel like, with the whole Me Too movement. You know, when men come forward about abuse that they have suffered, they are not taken as seriously as women who come forward with abuse that they have suffered. Going back to their childhood and what little evidence we have of their abuse, their alleged abuse, they are not being taken as seriously by the opposing side.
No, absolutely. I agree. And, I think that this has also led to the brothers doing appeal efforts over the years for prosecutorial misconduct and bias during their trials. I think that a lot of it ties into the fact that there are beliefs that they were not abused, and I think it also, again, it brings a huge question of, was the abuse real? It's so hard to sit there and say your experience was invalid. They were trying to say that it was never discussed before this trial, that it was a figment of their imagination that they just decided to use to try to save their ass.
So I think the only evidence that they have of that abuse is the certain family members coming forward about, like, I didn't witness this, but I know that something was going on. Something was off about this whole family situation, you know. The only other evidence that we have is a letter to one of Eric's cousins from Eric stating along the lines of, it's happening again. I stay up at night because I worry about my dad coming into my room and stuff like that. So, was the abuse real? I feel like.
And this was before the murders.
Exactly.
This was a while before the murders. So
It was almost a year before the murders. They had only planned the murder right before it happened. I feel like you can't really say that this is just him covering his own ass so that they cannot find him guilty. Because this was a little while before any of this, the brothers had even started talking about any of this stuff.
yeah, and I think that it also brings up the question of, did the fact that they were wealthy and privileged weigh into whether they were guilty or innocent? And what did the public's opinion, what role did that play in the outcome of this case, if, was there any?
I think when it comes to the rich and powerful, people think that they don't have problems. They've got all this money in the world, so they've got to be living these perfect lives.
Their issues aren't legitimate.
Exactly. So I think that's another thing is certain people aren't going to think that they were suffering this abuse at the hands of their highly known father.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think that it brought out that a lot of people, I feel like you even see it today, and I think it might even be a little bit more prominent because we do have the play of social media, and you can more easily access people's opinions for better or worse. I think that it brings that into play because of the fact that people illegitimize the suffering of people who are better off and better to do than they are. And I
Right.
think that that's crazy. And I also wonder, whenever it comes to these things, I question the fairness of their punishment. They were punished to life without the possibility of parole. Was this a fair sentence? Was it too harsh? What do you think? I mean, what do you feel like would have been an appropriate sentence here?
I feel like, based off of the evidence that we have when they were convicted, I feel like we know that there's a difference between manslaughter and murder. So, manslaughter being, let's say, yes, we know that they killed their parents, but it was premeditated, but it was due to the abuse that they suffered. Based off of that, I think they were punished too harshly. Because manslaughter, we know, is lesser charges. So I feel like it should have been tried as manslaughter versus murder.
I also feel like with this, and I understand these are completely different situations, but talking about famous cases of parental abuse, you have the case of Gypsy Rose, where
Right.
she murdered her mom after enduring years and years and years of physical abuse. Her mom made her get surgeries that she didn't need. She had her on medication. She was going through, I believe she even put her through chemotherapy. And Gypsy Rose conspired with her boyfriend and had her boyfriend murder her mom. Gypsy Rose was granted parole and she's out. She did time in prison for
Right.
this murder. Now I understand, like I said, these are two totally different situations, but I think that there's an appropriate amount of time to spend in prison for a situation like this where you pay for your crimes. And I think that there's a way to allow them to get out. Like I said, if they were my next door neighbor, I don't think that I would have any problems with that. I don't think that they're going to get out and reoffend. And I feel like that's something they took away their opportunity for a parole board to have other people decide that for them.
Right.
And I think with this case too, it has had such a cultural impact. The Netflix shows that are coming out with the media. Most recently, there's going to be a show, like I said, that they're going to have called the Menendez brothers on Netflix, where they are going to be discussing their case. And I'm very, very interested to hear what they have to say about this, because I think it's also going to have the potential to shape public conversations about familial abuse, mental health, sexual abuse, and the wealth that is in America and how it shapes our trials.
With the documentary and the oncoming documentary, it's, like we said, brought this case to the public eye once again. And the public has been very fascinated with this case, just like they were before.
Yeah, and I would also like to point out with this too, just because the public has a fascination with something, I feel like they're still glamorizing it.
Mm-hmm.
At the end of the day, the parents are dead. The brothers are in prison. The brothers allegedly endured some horrific assault. This is not a case to glamorize because you think that the people that act in the show are hot. People were really attracted to the brothers, and I think that that got people on their side.
That's definitely, I feel like, still going on now. We see the TikToks. We see everybody talking about. I just saw one about, oh, if this man, meaning Eric, gets released from prison, make sure he's not my neighbor.
Yeah, and people like, sending them a lot of money, sending them cards. They both got married in prison. Going kind of back away from the glamorization of this, they have gone into prison and they have just become exemplary inmates. I think that they have become mentors for people in the prison system. They recently became college graduates from UC Irvine, and they actively are working towards prison reforms. I think that they're doing amazing things with their time. I think that I would not have expected that out of them because I do feel like they still had the spoiled rich kid thing going on. I feel like they had a little bit of like kind of like a little douchey personality going on a little bit, and they seemed like they maybe could have gone in prison and just been pissed off at the world and done their time and left it alone. But I feel like they have gone in there and they have genuinely changed as people. And I think that they're taking their experiences and putting that to other people.
There are obviously some ongoing legal battles of whether they'll be able to get a new trial, they'll be able to get reduced sentences based on the new evidence that they got. You know, they have that letter from Eric to his cousin stating about the abuse from his father, which to me sounded like it wasn't the first letter that he had written him.
Yeah, and even I think the cousin testified that he had seen things that were odd in the home whenever he would come to stay.
Right. And there was also a member of the boy band Menudo from the 80s who had confessed that he was sexually assaulted by Jose as well. And you know, those are only two forms of new evidence that have come out. So it would be very hard for them, I feel like, to get a new trial based on just two pieces of new evidence that have come out. The only, you know, you've got 4 outcomes that could come of this, the new trial being one.
And now this is with the defense submitting these new pieces of evidence back in 2023. This is what we've been waiting to hear on what they are going to rule.
Right, and that decision will be happening, I believe, at the end of November. And the possible outcomes for that decision is that they could get out on time served. They can get a new trial, which, again, we said it's not as likely as one of the other options. It's also expensive.
You put millions of dollars into these trials.
They could go to the parole board, or there could be no change and they can still spend the rest of their life in prison. The defense is hoping to have the Menendez brothers home by this Christmas, which is very...
It's an interesting thought.
It is. I feel like it's pushing it a little bit because you have... The court date isn't until the end of November, so that leaves you with a month of possibly getting them out.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And it is definitely ambitious, but I don't think that it is completely crazy to have an idea of a potential release date at that point, or, you know, some path forward. This is all happening in good time for them, having these documentaries coming out, because it does show that the society is still backing the Menendez brothers. And I think as time has gone on, it has shown the Menendez brothers that there are more people that do believe them and that believe their story. I think, again, it talks about this kind of place to what's difficult. You know, there's 4 people that know the truth about this situation and 2 of them are not alive. It's very hard to be able to make a decision, but they've been in prison for almost 35 years now. And actually, I found that most recently, Kim Kardashian has written a letter to the judge trying to vouch for their release. Now, Kim Kardashian does a lot of work for prison reform. She does a lot of work for people who have been wrongly accused and for people who are sitting on death row awaiting the death sentence and things like that. And so I think that this letter from her may help. Obviously, the judge is going to decide one way or another, but I think that they're hopefully seeing all of these people that are vouching for these brothers and that they will make a decision that lets the brothers get out and, you know, be able to live a life. Because, you know, again, you ask yourself the moral question: were they victims of abusive upbringing? Was it a crime of greed and entitlement? I think that there's a potential for both sides here. I think that there's an argument for both sides. It was never a question of did they do it.
It was just a question of why. We have both sides that are potential motives. We go back to the abusive upbringing, and they basically both had suffered that abuse since childhood, and it only stopped for one of them.
Mm-hmm.
They also came from money. That could also have been a motive. We don't know. We only have what we have evidence on. It could, and you know what? It could be a mixture of both of them. Yeah. It could be a mixture of they suffered this abuse, they knew that they could get money,
and then they never have to work a day in their lives again if they got the money from their parents and said, oh, it was just a mom hit, and they go and they live their life.
Exactly. That looks like that is all we have for this episode. We want to hear your opinions and your comments on both of these cases that we have covered today.
Yes, please let us know what you are thinking, because these have been just running in our brains for months now at this point. And I would love to have outside thoughts and opinions on this. I just want to know what everybody else is feeling here.
Do we think they're guilty? Do we think they're innocent? Obviously, like we said, the Menendez brothers, we know they're guilty, but Do you think the abuse was real?
Should they be let out?
Should they be let out?
Is Scott Peterson innocent?
We will find out soon, hopefully.
Let us know what you think.
That brings us to the end, and tune in next week for our next episode, where we will talk about two cases that we feel like are not very well known. One being Joanne Matuk-Romaine, which is a case that Brianna had not heard about until I had spoken up about it. And the Idaho 4 case, which is a case that Brianna and I had. It's the reason that we kind of got into, the conversations about this stuff. We feel like not as well known of a case as it should be. We will see y'all for our next episode. Thank y'all so much.
Thank you guys for listening.